The Black Death killed roughly 75 million people between 1347 and 1353. It was the single deadliest pandemic in human history. Entire villages vanished. Populations collapsed. Families were erased. The medieval world experienced what can only be described as a civilizational crisis. But here's what most historians won't tell you. The plague didn't just destroy, it redistributed. It didn't just kill the poor and rich equally. It fundamentally restructured economic power. Because when you strip away the romanticism of medieval history, you discover something far darker and far more interesting. The greatest wealth transfer in pre-modern history wasn't triggered by conquest or revolution. It was triggered by a bacterium. And those who survived didn't just inherit emptiness, they inherited opportunity. Welcome to the Intentional Wallet, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how plague created wealth, you have to understand what the medieval economy looked like before it struck. Europe in the 14th century was locked in a labor stranglehold. Populations were dense relative to available work. The feudal system meant most people were bound to the land. Mobility was restricted. Wages were suppressed by overabundance. A peasant had few bargaining positions. A noble had many. Land was the only real source of wealth, and land was hoarded by aristocratic families who had owned the same estates for centuries. Social mobility didn't exist. Class was permanent. For a person born a serf, the path to freedom was so narrow it barely existed. And because there was always another desperate peasant willing to work for almost nothing, there was no reason for anyone to pay more. The system was designed for stagnation. Every person above you had every incentive to keep you below. Then the plague arrived. It wasn't a gradual decline. It was a sudden, catastrophic depopulation. In some regions, mortality rates exceeded 50%. Entire rural communities were emptied in months. The psychological shock was matched only by the economic shock. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers. The abundant labor supply that had kept wages artificially low for centuries evaporated almost overnight. A peasant with a pulse became rare, and rarity creates leverage. What followed was one of the most dramatic shifts in medieval economic power. In England, laws like the Statute of Labourers were passed specifically to try to cap wages and prevent workers from demanding more. The fact that these laws existed at all proves the point. For the first time in recorded medieval history, workers had negotiating power. Nobles were desperate. Fields needed harvesting. Castles needed maintaining. Roads needed repair. Churches needed workers. Labor scarcity was suffocating the entire feudal economy, and wages controlled for centuries began to rise. Not gradually, drastically. In some regions, agricultural wages doubled within a generation. In others, they nearly tripled. Workers could now demand not just higher pay, but mobility. They could demand better conditio, enes. They could demand a cut of harvests beyond bare subsistence. For the first time, a serf could leave one lord and negotiate with another. The ability to walk away was an ability to demand concessions. Landlords who had always assumed infinite supply suddenly faced genuine competition for labor. They had to offer better terms or watch their estates collapse into disrepair. This sounds like a minor economic shift. It wasn't. It was the beginning of the end of feudalism. The rigid system that had locked people into permanent bondage for centuries started to crack because the scarcity of labor gave workers something feudalism was never supposed to allow: choice. But the wealth creation didn't stop with wages. It extended into land ownership itself. The plague didn't just kill peasants. It killed nobles, clergy, merchants, and landowners. Large estates that had remained in family hands for centuries suddenly faced succession crises. There were no heirs, or the heirs died before they could claim their inheritance, or distant relatives appeared from across Europe, claiming rights they had barely maintained for generations, only to die themselves within months. Land that had been locked away in aristocratic holdings suddenly came on the market. Forced sales, estate liquidations, property transfers to pay funeral expenses and death taxes. And who had money to buy it? Not the traditional nobility. They were often in debt after the plague disrupted revenue collection. Manorial income had collapsed. Tax collection was chaotic. But there were others, merchants who had survived and who still had capital in circulation, craftspeople who had accumulated wealth from their elevated wages, moneylenders who had profited from desperate borrowers. Anyone with capital saw an unprecedented opportunity. For the first time, a non-noble could purchase significant land. A merchant could become a landowner, not through inheritance, but through capital accumulation. The invisible wall that separated merchant class from landed nobility began to crack. Within a century of the plague, you see the rise of a new merchant elite. These weren't feudal lords. They were bankers, traders, and entrepreneurs who had bought their way into land wealth during the post-plague chaos. Venice, Florence, Bruges. These cities became centers of power precisely because their merchants had capital when everyone else was scrambling. The Black Death created a liquidity event in real estate that fundamentally altered who could own property. Then there's the craftspeople angle. The plague killed masters and apprentices alike. Entire trades were decimated. Generations of knowledge were lost when apprenticeships were broken. But here's the crucial part. Demand for goods didn't disappear. A town still needed a blacksmith. A castle still needed a mason. A monastery still needed a stone carver. Essential skills became impossible to replace quickly. But now there were fewer skilled workers to fill those roles. A craftsman who survived the plague could demand significantly higher wages, charge more for his work, triple his output, and even demand a bigger cut of profits if he was running a business. Some thrived enough to become workshop owners. Others accumulated enough wealth to purchase land themselves. The scarcity of skill, combined with sustained demand, created explosive wage growth for anyone with specialized knowledge. This is why the 15th and 16th centuries saw the emergence of the artisan class as a genuine economic force. These weren't nobles, they weren't peasants anymore. They were a new tier of society built on the scarcity created by plague. The guild system that had previously been restrictive, limiting who could become a master craftsman, actually became more valuable because mastery in a trade now conferred real economic power. You couldn't create competition by lowering standards when there literally weren't enough people with the standards to begin with. What makes this pattern even more striking is what didn't change. Land remained the primary source of wealth. The feudal system didn't collapse immediately, but the fundamental power dynamic shifted. Workers had leverage. New entrants could access land ownership. Specialized skills commanded premium compensation. The system that had kept people locked in place for centuries suddenly became porous, and porous systems allow wealth to flow in new directions. In Italy, this post-plague mobility accelerated the rise of merchant families that would define the Renaissance. The Medici didn't come from ancient nobility. They came from a banking family that benefited from the economic chaos and opportunity of the post-plague period. They had capital when others didn't. They could invest when the market was dislocated. They could take risks because the downside was already priced in. The plague destroyed the old order. The survivors rebuilt it differently. They built it with themselves at the top. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. This wealth creation came at a cost measured in corpses. 75 million people had to die for the survivors to get richer. The widow whose husband died didn't benefit from his higher earning potential. The child who lost both parents couldn't buy land with inherited capital. The plague wasn't an impersonal economic force. It was human suffering on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. And yet, from that suffering emerged new fortunes, new classes, new possibilities. This pattern is not unique to the Black Death. Every economic catastrophe, every war, every collapse, every sudden depopulation creates a similar dynamic. When the old order is destroyed, survivors can rebuild it to their advantage. Capital becomes more valuable when competition is scarce. Skills become more valuable when practitioners disappear. Land becomes transferable when inheritance lines are broken. And if you step back, this pattern feels surprisingly modern. Economic crises today create similar dynamics. When industries collapse, disruptive entrepreneurs buy the assets at depressed prices. When employment disrupts, those with scarce skills extract enormous compensation. When established hierarchies falter, new players can establish dominance. The mechanics are the same. A medieval serf couldn't become a landowner through savings and hard work. The system was designed to prevent that, but plague broke the system. A modern worker trapped in a consolidating industry faces similar constraints until the industry crashes. Then the constraints disappear. A wage earner suddenly has leverage. An entrepreneur suddenly has opportunities. A restructured economy suddenly has openings. The deeper lesson is that extreme rigidity creates the conditions for disruption. When systems are too tight, they eventually break. And when they break, those positioned to take advantage emerge with unprecedented power. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to